Right, let's have a look at annotating this poem. So first of all, let's just recap. Hopefully by this point, we have agreed that the purpose of the poem is to expose the brutalities of the war in Vietnam committed by the American forces, to expose how shallow and kind of superficial the coverage was on the American news of it, about how kind of the true horrors of the war and the effects on the people in Vietnam weren't necessarily conveyed by the news to the American people, and also about how little was known about Vietnam, so that America kind of just marched into this war, and the general public didn't really have an appreciation for the lives of those in Vietnam, which is kind of like a common thing, really, isn't it? When we, over history and time, we've seen countries getting involved in wars. It's kind of the, and colonialism also, you know, the destruction of a culture. So let's have a look at what Denise Levertov is doing to kind of allow us to come to those conclusions about her poem. So the notable thing is obviously the structure, which is like a question and response type thing. So you can see, look, they're numbered here. Question one's answer, and it corresponds all the way through. All right, and the reason that this is done, I think, is to give the impression that there's some sort of educational investigation going on here, possibly, you know, in the future, in years away from the actual war. And Denise Levertov, I guess, is exploring the idea that potentially if Vietnam had been destroyed and its culture had been destroyed, all that would be left would be sort of textbooks and historical records, possibly not that accurate, about what Vietnam had been like originally. So she's exploring this idea that potentially in the future, the only way to find out about Vietnam is to go and do research in sort of simplistic textbooks. And so perhaps it's maybe a teacher asking a student questions. Some people have said that perhaps there's like a kind of a journalistic type thing going on. A journalist asking somebody who is potentially maybe knowledgeable about Vietnamese culture. So whatever you kind of think, you can't deny that there's some sort of investigation going on here and uncovering of information that is in the future possibly not known to the general people, because perhaps Denise Levertov is imagining a future where Vietnamese culture has been, in its original sense, has been destroyed by the war. So the questions here suggest that there's like some sort of association of Vietnam and Vietnamese tradition and culture being peaceful and beautiful. We've got ceremonies of the opening of buds. We've got quiet laughter. We've got things like epic poems. So very kind of traditional imagery that belongs to a time before mass media, before modern communication. So a really traditional and almost kind of like charming sort of way of living, speech, singing, ornaments, opening of buds, ceremonies. So there's something perhaps almost, you know, we've got religious connotations here. We've got idea of kind of natural materials. So it's a simplistic and kind of beautiful way of thinking that their culture has been. But obviously the kind of truth of it is exposed here, because however pleasant you may think Vietnamese culture once was, the truth which is exposed is that their lives, whatever they were like, and actually this is probably quite a naive way of sort of thinking of a traditional culture, isn't it? sort of thinking that perhaps people in Vietnam live very religiously and only have natural materials. Like, I'm sure their life wasn't as simple as that, but nonetheless, what can't be denied is that here we've got the truth being exposed with quite sort of brutal imagery. So we've got sort of like the symbolism of ceremonies here and opening of buds. Perhaps there's some sort of celebration of nature and new life assumed to be going on in Vietnamese tradition. And then we've got that kind of being undone, don't we? Because perhaps they once gathered to delight in blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. Okay, so you've got this destruction of life, of human life and nature here. We've also got the metaphor of their light hearts being turned to stone. So two ways of thinking about that. Literally, death, their hearts are beating no more. Or the effects of war. Almost like a kind of post-traumatic stress like effect there, isn't it? About kind of emotions becoming crushed and broken because of the traumatic experiences you might have as someone who is experiencing war. We've also got this recurring burning imagery, the burned mouth and the charred bones, which is all an allusion to the napalm that was used as part of the strategy. And you know, what does burning do? What does fire do? It takes out ecosystems, takes out towns, takes out structures, and it takes out lives. So we've got that very, very destructive imagery, and it's really this idea of a burned mouth and charred bones. It's really, really jolting, isn't it? It's very kind of uncomfortable to think about that. And, you know, you think about those images that we see that are quite famous of, you know, the person running down the street who is essentially burning alive because they've been hit by napalm. It's really jolting and really contrasts with the kind of the innocence of the opening questions. So if we also look at the language, we can see that there's often kind of passive voices used. It is not remembered, and it was reported. So there's no kind of agent doing it. Who's remembering? Who's reporting? It's kind of being depersonalized. And this is because Levertov's trying to show us how these experiences have become part of history and kind of written to textbooks and history, because she's again implying there's a destruction of kind of original culture. So all we've got left are records. And how this sort of destruction of culture leads to these records and kind of histories being the only so-called truth. And often I think she's imagining a time where the winners would write history. Now, of course, America lost the war in Vietnam. However, irrelevant of that, they still contributed massively to the destruction, and also the communist forces won. So again, communism has an agenda to destroy certain aspects of a country's culture when it is put into play. So she's not wrong, regardless of who the winners are, to imagine a time where aspects of Vietnamese culture and parts of the country and their traditions were destroyed. So this kind of formal language as well kind of gives it, it's another reason for us to kind of feel jolted, really, isn't it? Because you've got this detached way of describing these horrors of a burned mouth and charred bones and bombs smashing, and there was only time to scream. These are real kind of horrific war images, aren't they? That are very kind of upsetting and very raw. She's not dressing it up, is she, in kind of flowery language. She wants us to feel the truth of what happened. She's kind of contrasting what happened on the news, where often the truth was not necessarily conveyed, and she's kind of taken that upon herself to expose it. So if we're going to talk about the emotion of the poem, we could talk about, there's like a sense of loss. There's definitely some horror going on there. And there's definitely an attempt of some sort of exposure of brutality by Levertov. So there's a lot going on here. There's certainly more to unpick, but for me, those are the kind of the key things. The symbolism of life being destroyed, nature being destroyed, and the allusions to napalm and the burning, and the overall attempts for her to expose what happened, and to perhaps suggest that the danger of war, one of them, there are many obviously, but one of the dangers of war and kind of military action like that which America took, is the destruction of lives, the destruction of nature, and the destruction of a people.